So I want I know that I'm going to cut this short because this is a longer discussion, but I think that it's an important discussion that I want us to have moments with. So I pointed us out to this verse that Craig read. It was back in Deuteronomy 9. It was verses 4 and 5, right around there. It says, "And when the Lord your God has thrust them from your path, say not to yourself, the Lord has enabled us to possess this land because of our virtues. It is rather because of the wickedness of those nations that the Lord is dispossessing them before you. It is not because of your virtues," in verse 5 it continues, "and your vicissitudes that you will be able to possess their country, but it is because of their wickedness that the Lord your God is dispossessing those nations before you, and in order to fulfill the oath that the Lord made to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." So we see this repetition here, that it is not because of the virtue of these Israelites that they are going to possess the land of Israel. It's a really complicated and probably an unexpected verse to find in the Torah, because what we continually hear is that Israel is the biblical land. The reason that we are there is because we are the Jewish people, that we are the ones, because of our virtue, that we possess the land. And actually what this is saying, what the Torah itself is saying in Deuteronomy, it's actually God's just fulfilling a promise that he made not to us as individuals, but to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Right? He's saying that the Torah is saying that it's not even a promise made to the Israelites. It's to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So this relationship that we have to the land is far more complex and far more nuanced than we probably learned growing up, or that we read in whatever periodicals that we read. And it is one that doesn't go away. Right? The complexity of our relationship with Israel is not simple. It doesn't get easier, if anything, because anytime that we see its simplicity, that's wrong. And simplicity is what the only conversation that's winning the day. Simply right, simply left, simply right, or simply wrong. That the middle of those conversations are actually the most important ones, and the ones that aren't happening, at least in the broad sense. So there's an artist that I recently came across, Francis Alice, or Elise is, I believe, how he pronounces his name. I recently learned about this artist. He was born in Belgium. He's based in Mexico City now. His work is described as, it says Elise is known for his distinctive practice that addresses anthropological and geopolitical concerns through observation of and engagement with everyday life, is how his work has been described. His work, his modern works, has been shown in MoMA and Malba, which is the Buenos Aires Museum of Modern Art, and the Tate in London, and in Havana, and Toronto, and Tokyo, and here at the Hirshhorn. He has had shows, and I came across him online in an action, is what he calls it, because it's not a painting, it's actually some type of public performance, some public act of art. And he had a showing of this at the Tate, but I came across it online. So according to the description at the Tate, it says that, quote, in 1995, Elise realized an action in Sao Paulo called The Leak, in which he walked from a gallery around the city and back into the gallery, trailing a dribble line from an open can of blue paint. So he walked around the city and he created this blue line all throughout. And my understanding, reading more about this, that Elise's message was about the economic and social divides in society, which divides cities and people and places. And so this idea was to actually create a line between neighborhoods, between businesses, between people, to draw that out. So the Tate description
goes on that this action was reprised in 2004 when he chose to make a work in Jerusalem. Using green paint, Elise walked along the armistice border known as the Green Line, penciled on a map by Moshe Dayan at the end of the war between Israel and Jordan in 1948. I think it's interesting always how a museum chooses its words, right? It's trying to be the most neutral as possible. The war wasn't between Israel and Jordan. It was the war of independence between Israel and all of the surrounding countries and beyond. But they choose language that they think is the most neutral. So this remained the border until the Six-Day War in 1967, after which Israel occupied Palestinian inhabited territories east of the line, the Tate describes it as. It continues, though palpably absurd and greeted by onlookers with some bewilderment, Elise's actions of dribbling green paint behind him raised the memory of the Green Line of a time when the separation fence was under construction. He later encouraged various commentators from Israel, Palestine, and other countries to reflect on his action, and their voices, sometimes skeptical, sometimes approving, can be heard while the video of his action is screened. So in this gallery in the Tate, there were these interviews that were about him doing this green line. So on the website is a picture of Elise carrying a can of green paint with a trail of this green line behind him. And to me, this is a powerful reminder of what is this green line, right? What is this green line? Right? It happened to be just that Moshe Dayan, that was the color of the pen or pencil that he had. It was green. So there's nothing magical, there's nothing eco-friendly about the greenness of the green line. It was just the pen that he grabbed. It could have been purple, all right? But it is known as the green line. And the reason that I want us to have a few minutes of discussion about this green line, which was the armistice line in the War of Independence of 1948, the line was drawn in 1949. It was that area, the West Bank, was occupied by Jordan until 1967. And when they attacked and lost, it then became occupied by Israel. But what I'm afraid of is that the idea of the green line is fading. This idea that this demarcation somehow, at least on a map, that east of this line is not Israel. It's certainly not the modern state of Israel. When I grew up in the 70s and 80s, that line was talked about, doing things across the green line or within Israel proper. Well, after decades of just continuing to act as if it didn't really exist, right, now we have the sense that the line is just a conversation piece, and it's not actually a divide between Israel proper and this greater concept that people talk about of the biblical land of Israel or greater Israel, but it is not Medinat Israel. Some of that is the politics have kind of faded the line a little bit. Of course, in 93 and 95, Oslo I, Oslo II, didn't change the line of the green line, the boundaries of the green line, but it gave a different concept of how we think about those areas, with areas A and areas B and areas C. It complicated it more with the idea that it was going to be moving towards a Palestinian state. But I don't want to focus on statehood or security. I want to talk about this. I want us to focus our discussion on where does the green line play within our conversations today, because the hullabaloo of this past week coming out of pop culture when Ben & Jerry's says it will sell ice cream in Israel and not sell ice cream in the West Bank somehow has stirred us into a flurry. Or maybe a blizzard. And so I want us to spend this couple minutes about talking about what is the green line. I want to hear from you. What is the green line? Where are these borders of Israel? Kind of what's the end game that we have here? Because I think that not talking about the green line, we seem to act as if it doesn't exist, as if the West Bank is part of Israel, and it is not. And I don't know if that is the national end game as well, though there are political voices on all sides. So because I know that there are many, many people at home, I'll repeat some of your comments so that we can all participate in this way. So there is no way that I haven't stirred up a little controversy here, or agreement, possibly. But I want to hear from each other. I want us to hear from each other. What do we think about this green line and where it sits today? And how do we move forward? And how do we talk about it with each other without being othered or outed or shouted down? Because if we can't talk about these simple things within the congregation, how are they ever going to solve it there? So, someone want to start with their thoughts? Chazan.
I have a friend who lives in Tel Aviv. He's a former cantor who moved there close to his family. He's a progressive guy on the left. He attended J Street conferences for a long time. We don't necessarily agree on all policy related to Israel, but he loves Israel. He supports Israel. He lives in Israel. He pays his taxes in Israel. He votes in Israel, all that kind of stuff. And he was very supportive when the Ben and Jerry's thing came out and posted something on Facebook and said, "This is a long time coming. I don't like the occupation. This is a good way of doing it because they're differentiating," which in the end, obviously they didn't seem like they were differentiating. Unilever was differentiating, but that's getting in the weeds a little bit. Some people liked his post and agreed with him. Other people attacked him, all from the Jewish community, for his views. I was startled by how many people I saw on social media calling Ben and Jerry's anti-Semites, posting these GIFs, anti-Semites, ice cream, and all this other stuff.
So let me just capture a little bit for those that are at home, that the Chazan, saying he has a friend in Israel, pays his taxes, loves Israel, is Israeli, and that at first his friend posted on social media that he was in support of Ben and Jerry's decision, making the distinction between Israel proper and the West Bank, and he was surprised by the number of GIFs, JPEGs, whatever, memes that were coming out with these mock Ben and Jerry flavors that were humorous, but digging and calling this anti-Semitic, an anti-Semitic act.
So I think I was really disappointed, quite frankly. I had some close friends who were like yelling and screaming at him on Facebook. I found it really disappointing because it's like we cannot have a conversation about Israel without saying the Palestinians are worse, but Syria's worse, but Lebanon's worse, but of course they're all worse. Like that isn't the point, right? The point is like, what are we doing? You know, and I know Netanyahu's argument has been for years, it doesn't matter what we do, they're going to hate us. That might be true, but I think his argument, and I agree with him, is that like we still have to live up to some standard of our own, no matter what they do. And I think it was interesting to see so many people I knew, so many Jews I knew, from secular to religious, just going off on this like it was another blatant anti-Semitic attack on Israel.
So he concludes his thoughts by saying that the vitriol that was posted on social media against just a real hatred was really disappointing, because going a little bit beyond what you said, but it was going to the character of the people and not just the content of what they were saying. Did I capture? Okay,
Yeah,
great.
yeah.
Other thoughts? Yes, Samantha.
So what I think is interesting is that here in the U.S. we don't talk about the Green Line anymore, but actually, and it goes a little bit into that, Israelis do still reference the Green Line, and Israelis on both sides of the political divide.
Samantha points out that here in America we don't talk about the Green Line anymore, but in Israel it is still a thing. So what does that mean that we don't talk about it? Why do you think we don't talk about that anymore? And how does that complicate the conversation if we don't talk about the Green Line? If you have thoughts on that. Sure, I'm just pulling the thread.
I guess my thought is if we're talking about it differently from how people who actually live there are talking about it, our ability to help problem solve diminishes.
That's great. Samantha points out, if we are having different type of conversation here in the States than is happening in Israel, we're not having the same conversation. Our ability to help or to be supportive diminishes because we're having different conversations, different assumptions about what's going on. Adam.
So to get to your question, I can't speak to whether people in Israel talk about the Green Line more than we do or don't. But I think the fact that you pointed out that we don't talk about the Green Line that much really means that we've all accepted the status quo. And that greater Israel is now Israel.
So Adam says that he can't speak about how much we talk about it in America compared to what goes on in Israel, but the lack of mainstream conversation about the Green Line seems to de facto accept, Adam's saying, that we accept that whatever's happening over there is part of Israel. That is de facto part of greater Israel, has its own connotations, but that it is part of greater proper Israel. Yeah. Yeah. Randy's been like, with his eyes, been like, so I'm going to call Randy and then we'll come over here.
Just a couple of thoughts. First of all, there's lots of definitions of borders. As you rightly pointed out, the Green Line was an armistice line. It was not internationally recognized at any point as the borders of Israel. One could go back and say that the original partition plan, which would have created an Israel which was completely divided up and impossible to defend, was the original idea of the United Nations. But there was a war for independence that the Jews had to, that the Israelis had to immediately defend themselves, and those lines changed, and the war ended in 1948 with particular lines, as Rabbi, you pointed out, and nobody recognized them in the Arab world and the neighbors as the final borders. And there were negotiations, obviously everybody knows it, with Egypt and Jordan, which established borders with those nations. And even with Lebanon, to some degree, there's an established border at this point. But when 1967 happened, there was a war, and it was a defensive war. I think that was accepted at the time by the international community. It was thrust upon Israel, and the borders changed again. And the United Nations resolution at that time, Resolution 242, said that the ultimate solution would be that Israel would end up with secure and recognized borders. It did not say the armistice lines. And so from 1967, frankly, till Obama, the accepted international understanding of ultimate borders was that the borders would be negotiated. That changed, perhaps, with the Security Council resolution that happened in the waning days of the Obama administration. But up until then, the understanding legally, I'm only talking about legally from an international legal point of view, was that the Green Line was just accidental lines where armies stopped fighting at a particular point in 1948. So to elevate the Green Line as something sacred, maybe we want to do that, maybe we don't. But from a legal point of view, it wasn't until perhaps a couple of years ago.
So Randy is just, let me just summarize for people at home. Randy's making sure that history is clear on this, that the Green Line was an armistice line, as I said, that it wasn't it wasn't thought of as a defined international border, the border of a country, of Israel or any other country. When the 67 war was thrust on Israel and Jordan was defeated in that area that we're talking about, and others other further off Arab countries' armies were also pushed out of what we call the West Bank as well. And so Randy's suggesting, let's not elevate the idea of the Green Line too much, because that wasn't a sacred border. It was something to be later negotiated, and it hasn't yet been resolved. Is that?
And then if I can just make one final point.
Yeah.
Briefly, which is for those who say that we should return to the Green Line, understand that the old city of Jerusalem, the Western Wall, the Temple Mount, the Jewish quarter of the old city are settlements. Those are across the Green Line. So if you want to say return to the Green Line and that's the ultimate resolution, except at the same time that perhaps the beating heart of the Jewish people gets out of Jewish control. And we know what the history of that is that when that happens, Jews tend not to have access to those important areas.
So it's important to recognize that when we talk about the phrases and words matter, saying going back to the 67 line, to the Green Line, means also that parts of Jerusalem would be divided, including the Temple Mount and others. So therefore, simplicity, as I opened with, is not the full answer. Right? The simple line of go back to the Green Line or go back to 67 borders isn't going to be the final resolution to this, because it will divide the beating heart of the Jewish people, Randy said. So, yeah. Behind you, and then Jonathan. Yeah.
So I lived in Israel from 1991 to 2003. So some of us in Israel never crossed the border to the West Bank, even though there may not be a border. Sometimes there is a post, sort of like making sure you are aware that you are moving out. But some of my friends in Jerusalem, many Americans there, they continue, if there's, some of the settlements are adjacent to Jerusalem, they go there like, this is my land. So the border really depends who you ask.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other thing I would say, Israel before Rabbi was assassinated was different in my, that's totally my personal opinion of Israel after 1995. Something shook the country, and to me, it became more polarized after that, because something that would never have thought to happen in Israel, like Americans can kill presidents, but Israelis don't do that. So people are very set on their beliefs. And again, I agree with the historical background just shared, that there is nothing magical about a line, but there should be some conversation that is not happening.
Yeah.
And then like it may end up being more transactional. Get that, on the other hand, you build the bridge, but nothing is happening now. And it gets so polarized that it's like there is no talking at all.
Yeah.
So that's what we need to
So in living in Israel for a long time, that you had friends that made no distinction. They went wherever they went. And other friends you had were very clear not to go into that area as well. And then you ended by saying that we need to be having more conversations about what this means and how to build whatever we're going to build, because nothing is happening. That all that's happening is that we're stuck right here. And the stuckness I'm adding, you didn't say this, but the stuckness is not good for anyone. It is not good for anyone. And then Jonathan, I see Craig over here, but I'm aware of time. So Jonathan, and then I want us to continue this at Kiddush afterwards and a lot further. So Jonathan.
I'll try to be quick. I wanted to respectfully disagree with what Adam said, to the effect that American Jews consider the area across the Green Line as part of Israel. I don't think that's the case for certainly a lot of people. I think the lack of discussion reflects almost the kind of despair. You don't have to be partisan of Netanyahu seems like, their minimum requirements just don't overlap at the moment. And the question is, what do you do about it? And how do you hang in there, as it were, until a time comes when maybe there will be some overlap between the minimum requirements and an agreement community.
Yeah. So Jonathan's saying he wanted to disagree with Adam, but knowing both of you well, you're actually not in disagreement. Your verbiage was just a little different. That Adam had said that maybe because we're not having this conversation, it means that we de facto accept that the West Bank is part of Israel proper. And Jonathan was just using different language, just saying the reason the conversation is happening is because we're actually despairing of not knowing what to be able to do. I think both have aspects of truth to it, that I think that we do despair, and that is why we have to have these conversations.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that we have to have these conversations and not cut each other off. Because this is the essence of what it means to love Israel, is to have these conversations and not to be afraid of these conversations with each other. Social media is not the platform. The fact that a pop culture Ben and Jerry's is prompting us to have these conversations, that's the wrong prompt. It has to come because we love Israel. That's why we're having these discussions about what the green line is and so many other conversations. That is the essence of what it means to be part of this community. And I hope in other communities that you are a part of, is that first and foremost, it is our love of Israel that draws us into these conversations. And so with that openness of our heart and our passion for our love of Israel, I want us to delve more into this. This isn't the first time I have said this. And I hope that we'll start at Kiddush. I see there's other hands, but I'm also aware of time. And you think Jerusalem's sacred, so is finishing and getting to Kiddush. So,
12 o'clock.
so I'm gonna put a pin on this, because remember, as Deuteronomy says, that we do not have Israel because of our merit. This is because of the fulfillment of a promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which means that we have to bring our best selves to this, to possess, to nurture, and to love the land of Israel. Shabbat Shalom.